Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel, True Crime and Felines. For my returning subscribers, welcome back, my feline friends. For those that are new here, my name is Brandy, and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my 14 felines. And you are going to be awful again today, aren't you? I hope my videos are entertaining enough so that you will stick around and become a feline friend. I am sorry for the glasses, but I usually film at night and my week has been very hectic, so I'm filming in the morning. So please forgive me. Now this week's case is a tough one. There's going to be a lot of triggering information. It has to deal with abortions, and which include illegal late-term abortions as well, and other illegal and unethical activity around the women's medical services. I'm not presenting this case to start a debate on whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. I'm just presenting you with this case because it was not covered much in the news, and we'll go over that why. And I also ask that in the comments you please don't start an argument or a debate. You don't have to agree with somebody else's opinion, but please respect that other people are going to have different beliefs. But regardless, in this case, this tragedy should have never happened. So, if you're still here, let's get started. Kermit Gosnell was born February 9th, 1941 in Philadelphia. He was the only child of his parents, and his parents worked as a gas station attendant and a government clerk. When Kermit was a child in 1952, he wanted to go to the local YMCA, but he was denied entry due to his race. This would end up having a pretty profound effect on Kermit, and he decided that his goal was to make changes in his community. So Kermit graduated from the very prestigious Central High School in 1959. Then he attended the University of Pennsylvania, and from there he would make a transfer to Dickinson College, where he would earn a bachelor's degree. After that, he went on and studied medical sciences and got his medical degree at Jefferson Medical College in 1966. Now for the remainder of this video, I'm still going to call him Kermit, and I'm not going to call him Dr. Gosnell because he did not deserve his doctor title. So Kermit spent 4 decades coming back to his community and actually giving medical services to the poor and the needy, and he would even give those medical services for free for those who could not pay. And if a child was out on the street and was playing on a bike or a skateboard and got hurt, they would just know to come to Kermit, and he would take care of them for free as well. Kermit recognized in his neighborhood there was a lot of drug activity and addicts, so he ended up opening a halfway house, which was also a rehab clinic for drug addicts, and actually had a teen aid program as well for the impoverished. So he was trying to really solve these social issues that his community was facing. Now, even back in the early 60s, Kermit was very vocal about women's rights around abortion. Now, this was a very hot topic button at the time because Roe versus Wade was starting to ramp up. So right before Roe versus Wade decision in 1972, Kermit actually opened up his own clinic that offered women's medical services called the Women's Medical Society. And along with other women's medical services, he would also perform abortions here as well. This clinic was located at 3801 Lancaster Avenue, and over the years would become both a blessing and a nightmare to the community. When the clinic opened, the Philadelphia Inquirer actually interviewed Kermit in October of 1972. And Kermit was quoted as saying, "As a physician, I am very concerned about the sanctity of life, but it is for the precise reason that I provide abortions for women who want and need them." Due to Kermit's charity giving and trying to help the community, he was actually up for an award from the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and it was the Young Philadelphians of the Year award. Kermit would end up marrying 3 different times in his lifetime and would have 6 children total. Now, as far as the Women's Medical Society, that became a very popular clinic. Kermit's patients were poor, impoverished immigrants, and he would help them. Now, again, this was at the pinnacle of the Roe versus Wade case in 1972, and a women's group came up with, I guess you could call it a publicity stunt, to get the legislature's attention regarding pro-choice, and they ended up involving Kermit. So what they did is that in Chicago, where abortion was illegal at the time, they loaded up a bus with 15 poor, impoverished women. Ow! Don't bite! And all these women were in their 2nd trimester of pregnancy. They drove the bus to Pennsylvania to the Women's Medical Society. Kermit, along with another doctor, would actually perform abortions on these 15 women for free. However, they were using an experimental method called a supercoil. Here's how a supercoil is supposed to work from the mouth of an employee that used to work under Kermit. He quotes, "It was supposed to be plastic, basically plastic razors that are formed into a ball. They were coated in a gel so that they would remain closed. These would be inserted into the woman's uterus, and after several hours at body temperature, the gel would melt and these things would spring open, hence the coil. And what it was supposed to do, supposedly cutting up the fetus, and then the fetus would simply be expelled." As you can imagine, this caused several complications for the women. 12 out of the 15 women had some medical issues regarding this. 3 of the women actually had to go to the hospital because the complications were so severe, and they ended up having to have hysterectomies because of it. Now, this publicity stunt ended up as a hearing at the federal level where Kermit had to go testify. The weird part about it is that Kermit wasn't charged for anything. The issue was that the women were not told that this medical procedure was experimental. At the hearing, Kermit would state that he was actually doing something about the women's movement instead of just talking about it. This hearing resulted in actually changing the laws around having to inform a patient that a medical procedure was experimental, and Kermit was not charged or fined or anything, and he was able to go back to his clinic with his license still in good standing. Even after this publicity stunt and the media around it, Kermit was still considered a very good doctor and an upstanding citizen in his community. It became very well known in the area that if other clinics would turn a woman away due to being so far along in her pregnancy, they could go to the Women's Medical Society and Kermit would take care of them. By 2011, Kermit was charging $1,600 to $3,000 per late-term abortion, and he was making per day anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000, which equated to about $2 million a year in cash. I think this is where Kermit's good intentions turned to greed. So his clinic was operating ever since 1972, and it wasn't until 1989 that the first complaint or fine had happened. In 1989, the Pennsylvania Department of Health had cited his clinic for having no nurses in the recovery room. They would cite him again in 1993 for the same thing. So what Kermit decided to do was employ some nurses. Unfortunately, his employees were unlicensed. So in 1996, his clinic was fined for employing unlicensed personnel in the clinic that were performing duties a nurse or doctor should do. For example, there was a 15-year-old girl who was hired first as the receptionist. She was told to read a medical book, which she read for about 20 minutes, and from then on, she became the clinic's anesthesiologist. Another example was there were other staff performing abortions that had no training, had no medical background, and of course were unlicensed. Now 1996 was kind of a pivotal year because of a new governor that got into place in Pennsylvania and some changing of some laws. Kermit's clinic would not be inspected again for the next 15 years. So this obviously made the clinic worse. So in 2000, the first official complaint from a patient came in. A woman named Samika Shah called the clinic the day after her abortion, and she reported that she was bleeding heavily and that she was in pain. It was reported that Kermit told her not to come to the clinic and not to seek any emergency medical services because her abortion was so late term that they would both get in trouble, and that she should just lie down and it'll pass. 3 days later, Samika's family finally took her to the hospital. There they discovered that she had a perforated uterus and she had sepsis, or a bloodstream infection, from this injury. She would end up dying at the hospital. Her family complained to the state and the Pennsylvania officials about what happened. And unfortunately, the attorney at the time for the Pennsylvania Department of Health simply said, "People die. It happens." So her children ended up filing an official lawsuit, which ended up being settled out of court by Kermit for $900,000. In 2001, Kermit announced that his clinic was part of a state program that was administered by the Pennsylvania Health Department's Division of Disease Control, giving out children's vaccinations. The health department would check in on this program, but would not inspect the clinic. They were just looking at the records about the vaccines and using the grant money. Now, the health department would regularly suspend this program for the clinic because Kermit's clinic was failing to keep accurate logs, and they were unsanitarily storing the vaccines in inappropriate refrigerators or not at the temperatures recommended. In 2006, a lawsuit was filed by another patient. The patient's name is unknown, but during an attempted abortion, apparently Kermit was unable to complete the procedure. The patient stated that she was laying in the recovery room, bleeding, in pain, and needed help. but Kermit refused to help her or even call any emergency personnel in. The patient reported that she felt like Kermit was just letting her die. Now, the patient did end up surviving, and she ended up recovering after leaving the clinic and being able to get emergency services. However, by the time she came forward, this incident had happened a long time ago, and the lawsuit was dismissed by the courts as being beyond the statute of limitations. 2009, one of the health department's representatives that were overseeing that children's vaccine program discovered Kermit was actually scamming the program and using the grant money not for the vaccines but for his clinic. She actually also accidentally stumbled upon some financial records identifying the fraud, and on those records also accounted for the most shocking elements of what was actually going on at the clinic. She would take these back and raise concern about Kermit's clinic, but she was ignored. And later in the trial, it was stated that those reports were lost. They went into a black hole somewhere. In that same year, a patient named Karnamaya Monger, she was a 42-year-old refugee who did not speak English. She had actually died in Kermit's care. She only weighed 90 pounds and she was 18 weeks pregnant. She came in for an abortion and she was given a lethal dose by accident of anesthesia and painkillers, and she stopped breathing. Now, there was a sign up on like a cabinet of anesthesia and stuff that would tell the unlicensed staff how much anesthesia to give somebody. It was just kind of static instructions, so it did not account for the weight of the patient or any other of their medical history. So you inject a 90-pound person full of things that you inject a 200-pound person, and yeah, that's gonna affect them. Staff were unable to revive Karnamaya because, well, one, their defibrillator just was out of order and wasn't working, and they didn't have another one, of course. And when the emergency personnel was finally called, they were to come to the back door of the clinic and able to get to her faster instead of coming through the front. However, the back door of the clinic had been locked, which is actually kind of illegal because you need a emergency exit. And it took 20 minutes for Kermit to find the key to unlock the door. So not only did they delay in calling emergency services for Karnamaya, there was an additional 20 minutes where she might have been saved if the emergency personnel were allowed in the back door. So unfortunately, they were unable to save her when she might have been able to be saved if Kermit was operating his clinic ethically. So for most of Kermit's career, this clinic had over 46 different lawsuits in 32 years. That's like a lawsuit plus every year. The community became aware of, these lawsuits over the years, and they started putting blame on the Pennsylvania regulators for seemingly to overlook repeated complaints, concerns, and lawsuits about this clinic. Overall, the clinic was accused of lacking trained staff, hiring unlicensed staff, barbaric conditions, and the illegal late-term abortions Kermit was giving women. Now, in 2009, the FBI actually had started an investigation on the clinic, but it had nothing to do with its conditions, its illegal late-term abortions, or even the death of Karnamaya. What it had to do with was that it was suspected that Kermit was running what they called a pill mill, where he was writing prescriptions to patients for cash for controlled substances such as Oxycontin, painkillers, codeine, anything like that. So in February of 2010, the FBI finally got enough information and decided to raid the clinic. So they got a search warrant, and with the help of state authorities, they showed up to the clinic. When the FBI and authorities entered the clinic, they were appalled. They described the clinic as filthy, deplorable, disgusting, very unsanitary, very outdated, horrendous, and by far the worst they had ever seen. They stated that there were blood on the walls and on the floor, and we're talking old blood that was never cleaned up, not because just a procedure was just done. It smelled of stale urine and ammonia, and they ended up finding cats that were free roaming in the clinic, and they were flea infested and apparently just went to the bathroom wherever they pleased. And this was not cleaned up either. I mean, hey, I'm all for cats as they help with recovery, but you gotta stay sanitary, guys. Because the raid took place when the clinic was open, they stated that there were semi-conscious women moaning in both the waiting room and recovery rooms, and that they sat or laid on dirty recliners, dirty surgical beds, and they were covered with blood-stained blankets. Now, it was determined later that these women were sedated by the unlicensed staff. And when the staff was asked how much or when or what did you give these people, the staff couldn't say because, of course, they never kept it on a log or wrote it down on a chart. Many of the medications found at the clinic were also found to be expired, including the children's vaccinations. The surgical procedure rooms were filthy and unsanitary, and one FBI agent said it would resemble a gas station bathroom, if you didn't know any better. The instruments were not sterilized, and equipment was rusty and outdated. There was oxygen equipment in the rooms covered in dust, so obviously no cleaning was taking place at this clinic. If that wasn't bad enough, they discovered these suctioning tubes, and there was only a few tubes to go around the whole clinic, and it was reported by the staff that no, they didn't buy new tubes, they would just reuse them. So if somebody had an abortion that morning, the tube was then just kind of rinsed out in the sink. And if somebody needed like a breathing tube, that same tube was used for that on the next person. They also stated that the surgical instruments were not sterilized between use and used between the women as well, which then caused, STDs and who knows what else passed between patients. Once they got into kind of the storage area of the clinic, they would be disturbed to find several fetal remains that were stored in refrigerators, freezers, and not disposed of properly. They were stored in trash bags, milk jugs, orange juice cartons, and even cat food containers. In the basement, they found a lot more medical waste that was piled high. It was later discovered that Kermit had a dispute with his medical waste company and stopped paying the bills, so they stopped picking up the waste. But the most disturbing thing that the FBI had found was that in Kermit's office there were specimen jars, and inside those specimen jars were the feet of several fetuses. like being almost kept as trophies. In all, about 45 fetuses were found, and 10 to 20% of those were older than 24 weeks, which at the time was the legal limit of abortion. Just a trigger warning, this is going to get a little bit uncomfortable, but some of the fetuses they found, particularly 7 of them, were so far above the 24-week limit that they were pretty much, they could have survived. And what was more disturbing about this is that after talking to staff and Kermit, it was later found out that Kermit was not aborting these extremely late-term pregnancies using abortion medical procedures. What he was doing was he was sedating the women, giving them drugs to induce labor, and then when they went into labor and delivered the baby, I mean, at this point it's not a fetus, it's a baby. If the baby happened to be alive and breathing when it came out, he would take surgical scissors and would snip the spine on the back of the neck. They called this snipping, and apparently it happened a lot. The staff would state that this was a standard procedure at the clinic, so you can imagine how many late-term abortions they actually did. The staff would report that there had been a lot of late-term abortions where the baby was alive or breathing and was then snipped. Now, obviously, Kermit's license was suspended immediately. She should have been yanked at that point, but he was suspended. The investigation began, and as staff and patients were interviewed, more disturbing information would come out besides what they already knew by being at the clinic. One patient described that she was very late in her pregnancy, over 24 weeks, and she was given labor-inducing drugs instead of having an abortion procedure done. And they gave her the drugs and placed her on a toilet. She ended up birthing the baby in the toilet. She said she was then removed to a recovery room, and a staff member fished the baby out of the toilet, and she never saw the baby again. A janitor, the place had a janitor, guys. This is what I don't get. A janitor that worked at the place, I mean, what the hell did you do? The place was terrible. Did you even clean? Anyway, the janitor stated that, placing a woman on a toilet happened so much that there were times that the fetus would go down the pipes and plug up the place. It also came out that Kermit was largely absent from the clinic for most of the day. He would only come in a couple nights and worked late at night, probably because he was doing illegal late-term abortions. But during the day, it was pretty much run by his unlicensed, untrained staff. Another patient that was interviewed stated that she was left lying on one of the dirty tables for hours after Kermit ended up tearing her cervix and her colon. Her relatives who were in the waiting room finally intervened and took her to the hospital, where she had to have surgery to correct her issues. Another woman had her uterus punctured, and she was held for hours, and they would not let her leave nor call emergency services. When they finally let her go, her family took her to the emergency room, where she required a hysterectomy to save her life. Another family member reported that it was either an aunt or a mother was there to get a procedure and ended up having a epileptic episode. She wasn't strapped to the table, and she ended up falling off the table and sustaining a head injury. The family member stated that Kermit would not let them get help, call help, or take the patient out of the clinic, but Kermit or the staff wouldn't do anything to help the patient either. That patient ended up surviving, but with some damage. They also discovered, surprise, surprise, that the laws that were intended to safeguard women and children were not followed. There was supposed to be mandatory counseling for anyone that is seeking an abortion, and that wasn't done. Basically, if a woman walked in, Kermit or the staff would do the abortion that day. There was also, of course, a consent for minors, that if a minor walked through the door, they had to have their parent or guardian's consent, and that wasn't followed either. And finally, the waiting periods between abortion procedures were not followed either. If you had an abortion yesterday, there is a waiting period that you have to wait before you're able to get another abortion. The clinic did not follow that. So if somebody got an abortion today and went out and got pregnant the next month, they could come back and Kermit would perform the abortion with no waiting period. Now, obviously, third trimester abortions happened a lot, and Kermit would demand more money for those, of course. The staff would talk about how Kermit and his wife would come in on a Sunday and offer patients what he called a Sunday special. Now, only Kermit and his wife were at the clinic for these Sunday specials, and staff were not allowed because the clinic was closed. Apparently, these Sunday specials were only offered to women who were very late in their pregnancy or who were more medically difficult. And I tried to look, but I'm not sure what that means. And the only thing I could think of is maybe they had twins or triplets that they were trying to abort. When the authorities looked into Kermit's medical background, he did have a medical degree. However, it was discovered that he had not been medically certified in gynecology or obstetrics at all. So he would be performing these with no training, which is obvious why he got so many complaints and why so many women suffered complications. As far as the illegal prescription practices, it was estimated that Kermit took in $10,000 to $15,000 per night on top of his abortion services that he charged by giving out prescriptions of Oxycontin, other painkillers, sedatives for no medical purpose. The patient would just pay the clinic and here's your prescription. So in 2011, Kermit and his wife Pearl, which was his third wife, was arrested, along with many staff that worked at the clinic. Kermit was charged with 8 counts of murder and drug conspiracy. It was alleged that he killed 7 babies. They were not fetuses, they were babies, because they were born alive, which is first-degree murder. Now, authorities suspected that there were many more, but due to the falsifying of the records of the clinic, the lack of records at the clinic, they could not substantiate every individual case. For Carnamaya Monger, the woman who was under his care, he was being charged with third-degree murder in her case because he was accused of overdosing her with anesthesia and painkillers, hence causing her death. Now, Kermit participating in this pill mill, like they called it, which allowed patients to purchase certain prescriptions, and he allowed the patients to purchase prescriptions under different names. So this is where he started out well, but this is where I think his greed took over, and being ethical just went out the window because he was making so much money. The clinic went from writing like a few hundred prescriptions for controlled substances per month to over 2,000 prescriptions for controlled substances per month by 2010. And that's what caught the FBI's attention. Again, the drugs, not the illegal abortions, the complaints, the deaths, but whatever. Basically, Kermit would have his pad of prescriptions and he would just sign them, and they were blank. And then he would dictate his staff that if somebody was pill seeking, that they had to pay a fee, and then they would just write whatever prescription they were seeking. Now, after Kermit's arrest, he would become this woe is me person, and he was saying that he was close to destitute at this point. However, him and his wife owned at least 17 properties in 4 different states, and they had a $1 million house as well, so not quite destitute, Kermit. He also would state that he was not guilty and that all this would blow over and that he would be vindicated. He also would imply that pro-life activists actually were behind this because they were trying to close his clinic down because he offered abortions to the poor, which was unpopular, he stated, and also he would say because of his race as well. Now, after the story broke locally, we'll talk about, I'll go into later why this story really wasn't covered nationally. But when the story broke locally, a lot of former patients would come forward and talk about their experiences. Unfortunately, a lot of the times the statute of limitations ran out, so they could not be compensated or file the lawsuit of their own. In 1998, a young 15-year-old pregnant girl got to the clinic and she actually changed her mind about the procedure. She stated that she was actually sitting on the table and Kermit was there telling her to lay back, and that's when she changed her mind and did not want it done. An adult relative was with her, and the relative stated that Kermit became angry when she said she no longer wanted the abortion and changed her mind, that he would end up restraining her, ripped off her clothing, and would sedate her. She said she woke up 12 hours later at her aunt's house and the abortion had been performed without her consent. Because, you know, he got his money, right? That's really all he wanted by that time. In 2001, a 28-year-old woman who was 5 months pregnant described pain 4 days after her abortion procedure, and it was so bad that she couldn't even walk. She returned to the clinic and she had an ultrasound, and Kermit found fetal remains that were left inside her uterus. Because Kermit wasn't the one that performed the abortion on her, it was his untrained staff. So Kermit ended up suctioning out the remains, but using no anesthesia. And everybody's like, why the hell would he do that? Kermit charged his patients for levels of anesthesia. So if you were scraping by for money and could only afford the procedure, but you couldn't afford the extra money for anesthesia, he would just do it without. Another 15-year-old girl was actually awarded damages because her case, the statute of limitations had not expired. So her family and her were awarded damages because Kermit performed the abortion without parent or guardian consent. Now, in the case of Karnamaya, the refugee who died in Kermit's care, Kermit's lawyers tried to state that Karnamaya had other street drugs in her system, and she failed to tell him that, and that's how, you know, she ended up dying, because, you know, he didn't know. However, expert testimony stated that it was actually the Demerol that killed her, which was given to her by Kermit and his staff, and not some mystery street drug that killed Karnamaya. The level of Demerol that was given to Karnamaya was enough to kill a 250-pound person. She weighed 90 pounds. So through all this, Kermit was not the only one in trouble. State officials had failed to visit or inspect Kermit's practices since that 1996, right? There was a medical examiner sometime in this that alerted state officials that an abortion was performed on a 14-year-old girl who was 30 weeks pregnant, and officials did nothing about that or did any investigation. State officials also did not act when they were informed of the death about Karnamaya. We already know that, right? There was also a nonprofit organization that helps the underinsured connect with health services that they need. And they had stated that a lot of their clients, because, you know, the Women's Medical Society was a big place to refer people to at the time, that they reported their patients would complain to them about the conditions of the place. So when they approached state officials, they were told that they can't accept complaints from third parties, pretty much, that the patient would have to come to them themselves. So this nonprofit agency looked into, okay, how does a patient file a complaint? And then they stated that there was a 5-page form that was only available in English that required them to, 1, reveal their identities, and there was no clause to remain, you know, like, usually when you complain, you have to tell them your identity, but then there is a way where you can say, I would like to stay anonymous to the clinic. There was no clause saying that. And if they filled this form out and submitted it, they would also have to agree to be part of a court hearing testimony if these complaints ended up in the court. So the nonprofit did help these women as much as they could, but in the end, only 2 women agreed to fill out the form, but then the women told the nonprofit agency not to submit the complaint. So during this whole investigation in 2011, it was discovered that none of Pennsylvania's 22 clinics that performed abortions had been inspected in 15 years. Now, this stemmed from the governor's rule at the time that random inspections were perceived as to create a barrier to women seeking these types of services. You know, because if you randomly inspect a clinic and it was found to be deplorable, it would probably be closed. Do you really want deplorable clinics in your state? However, the inspections were supposed to be triggered by complaints, and obviously this didn't happen. The only response from these officials came after the local media coverage where they were being blasted for no oversight. In December of 2011, Kermit's wife Pearl pleaded guilty to performing illegal abortions and corruption, and she would be sentenced to 7 to 23 months in prison. The staff that was charged with crimes got anywhere from a few months to the top one of 10 years for their various involvements. The person who got 10 years had admitted to snipping a baby. So it wouldn't be until March of 2013 Kermit's trial would start, and in the opening statements the judge would end up dismissing 3 out of the 7 first-degree murder charges, but then the next day he would reinstate one, saying that the wrong charge was dismissed, and it was just a mess. They would go through the trial and Kermit would plead not guilty throughout this whole thing. When the jury finally came back, they were sort of deadlocked, but what they did is they did agree that Kermit was guilty on pretty much snipping like 3 of the first degree murders, which automatically put him up for the death penalty. So what Kermit ended up doing is that he took a deal in which he agreed to waive all his appeal rights in exchange that he would get life in prison to avoid the death penalty, and he would have no possibility of parole. So after pleading guilty to that and taking that deal, he would end up with 3 life sentences plus 30 years for the drug portion of his crimes. As for the state, the following changes were made. Abortion clinics are now held to the same standard as outpatient surgical centers. Changes in the oversight of abortion clinics as a whole. 6 employees were fired or removed from their positions due to their non-actions of the complaints and deaths through the years, including the attorney who responded to Samika Shah's family of "people die." The remains of the fetuses and babies that were found at the clinic were actually buried in the Laurel Hill Cemetery. In 2019, John and Linda McKeever installed a small memorial that read, "In memory of the babies that were lost at 3801 Lancaster Avenue." Now, as far as media coverage, this case was not covered as you think it would be in like national news. Unless you were local or you were following it on the internet in certain groups or blogs, you wouldn't know about it. Like, I didn't know about it until I ran into it a couple months ago. Now, people would chalk this up to just media bias or one of those, I ain't touching that with a 10-foot pole because it was too hot politically to engage in. Now, both pro-life and pro-choice groups want the story out there, as each group has its reasons that the community hears the story. Overall, even both groups can agree that this sheds light on some societal issues around the poor. So like I said before, Kermit had some very good intentions to start. And I wish greed wasn't a factor in this, but I do truly believe he started out wanting to help as many women as possible. But this is why we have the laws and the oversight and the compliance to protect people from those that get greedy, lazy. I mean, in the end, Kermit was taking advantage of the very people that he wanted to help. So what are your thoughts on this case? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you would like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back next Friday with another true crime case or mystery. Thanks, guys.